Whispers of a Lost Nebula. Chapter 1. The Descent. Captain Ilara Voss had spent her entire career chasing mysteries. As a deep space courier, she delivered goods to far-flung colonies and outposts, her only companions the stars and the hum of her ship, the Starlight Voyager. Yet, she yearned for more. Stories of the Lost Nebula, a dark, uncharted region where space itself seemed to fold upon itself, kept her up at night. They spoke of strange occurrences, ships vanishing, communication failures, and eerie, unexplained phenomena. Despite the warning signs, Ilara couldn't resist the pull. She had to see it for herself. Approaching the coordinates now, RYN, her first officer, said, breaking her reverie. The tone was steady, but she could sense the anxiety lurking beneath the surface. Prepare for entry, Owen, Ilara said, her voice firm, though her heart raced in her chest. Stay sharp. This place is unlike anything we've ever encountered. As the ship breached the outer edge of the nebula, the stars flickered out one by one, swallowed by the creeping mist that seemed to curl in on itself. The instruments on the dashboard began to glitch, signals distorting in a way Ilara had never seen before. We're losing contact with the outside, Owen reported, his voice tinged with unease. Keep trying, Ilara replied, her gaze fixed on the swirling blackness outside. We'll keep pushing forward. But something was wrong. The longer they drifted deeper into the nebula, the more Ilara felt an overwhelming sense of dread creeping over her. The air in the ship grew thick, almost oppressive. The hum of the engines, usually so constant, now felt muted, as if it were coming from a distance. Chapter 2. Crossing the Threshold. The ship lurched violently, throwing Ilara against her seat. The lights flickered and the alarms blared, but the sounds felt muted, distant. Stabilizers are offline. Arwin shouted over the noise, his hands moving frantically over the controls. We've hit something. Ilara's eyes scanned the monitors. There was nothing visible outside, just the swirling mists of the nebula, darker now, as if the very fabric of space had been torn apart. Hold on, Arwin, she barked. We need to get through this. But the ship continued to shudder, the turbulence growing more violent. The screens distorted again, and then silence. The sudden stillness was even more terrifying than the chaos. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly looked around the darkened cockpit. What happened? Owen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Did we? The words cut off as the intercom crackled. A voice, faint and distorted, broke through the static. Help us. Ilara's blood ran cold. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice trembling. Who was that? I don't know, Owen replied, his face pale. But it's coming from the depths of the nebula. The voice repeated, this time clearer. Help us, escape. Ilara's eyes met Ryn's. She knew what had to be done. This was no ordinary nebula. Something, or someone, was trying to reach them. And now, they were already too deep to turn back. We have to find the source, Ilara said, her voice now steady, resolute. Set a course for the signal. Full throttle. Ryn hesitated but nodded. He knew better than to argue with Ilara when she was determined. As the ship lurched again, Ilara braced herself, knowing they were about to cross a line that no one ever should. Chapter 3. Entering the Abyss. Ilara's ship cut through the dense mist, the air growing colder as they descended deeper into the unknown. The nebula had become a living thing, a presence that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. She couldn't explain why she felt so drawn to it, but it was as if something inside her had awakened. We're closing in on the signal, Owen said, his voice tight. But the interference is growing stronger. The screen before them flickered again, the image distorting like a broken mirror. And then it appeared. A massive shape, shifting in and out of view, barely perceptible against the blackness of the nebula. At first, it seemed like a ship, a vast, broken hulk floating aimlessly in the mist. But there was something off about it. The shape twisted unnaturally, stretching and shrinking, as if the very fabric of space was warping around it. Is that a ship? Owen whispered, awe and fear mixing in his voice. I don't know, Ilara murmured. But we need to find out. Without another word, she guided the ship toward the eerie figure. As they drew closer, The shapes in the mist began to take on form, human shapes, but distorted, their features blurred and moving as though caught in a twisted dream. The temperature inside the cockpit plummeted, and Ilara shivered, her breath fogging up the view. She could feel the weight of the place pressing down on them, as if something ancient and malevolent was watching their every move. Chapter 4: The Voice in the Dark. As they neared the mysterious structure, Ilara ordered Arwen to prepare a landing sequence. The ship descended toward the twisted wreck, its hull groaning under the strain. The air outside crackled with an unnatural energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Captain, I'm not sure about this," Arwen said, his voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right. We should." Ilara raised her hand. "I know. But we need to find out what's causing that signal." They landed with a jarring thud. Ilara stood from her seat, her legs shaky as she made her way toward the airlock. Arwen hesitated, but followed her out. The moment the door opened, a freezing gust of air hit them, and the stench of decay flooded their nostrils. The wreck they had landed on was no ship at all. It was a station, but not one made by humans. The walls were smooth, impossibly so, like polished obsidian, and the strange symbols that adorned every surface seemed to pulse with a faint light. "This is not good," Owen whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "I know," Ilara replied, her heart racing. "Stay close. We need to find the source of that voice." They ventured deeper into the station, their footsteps echoing in the hollow corridors. The walls seemed to close in around them as they walked, the temperature growing colder with every step. Suddenly, they heard it again. "Help us, help us." It was faint, like a whisper on the edge of their consciousness. But it was unmistakable. The voice was closer now, coming from deep within the station. Ilara pressed forward, her resolve hardening. They had to know what had happened here, and they would face whatever horrors lay ahead. I'll continue building on this and split the next chapters similarly, with a steady escalation of tension and horror. Let me know if this direction works for you, and I can continue expanding each chapter. Absolutely. Let's continue the story, adding more detail and expanding on the growing horror, as we follow Dan Harmon's story circle structure. Chapter 5: The Hollow Echoes. The hallway ahead stretched impossibly long, its darkness thick with a suffocating silence. Ilara and Arwen crept forward, their breath shallow, muffled by the eerie stillness. Each step seemed to reverberate louder than the last, their footsteps becoming an unwelcome presence in the void. The walls were adorned with strange markings, symbols that writhed in the dim light, as if alive. They pulsed in rhythm with the darkened hum that filled the station. "Do you see that?" Arwen whispered, pointing ahead. Ilara squinted through the gloom. Far ahead, in the distance, a faint light flickered, erratic and weak. It seemed to call them forward, like a dying star fighting against the void. Without speaking, they both moved toward it. The further they walked, the more oppressive the air became. It clung to them, thick and heavy. Ilara's pulse quickened, but she pushed forward, her resolve unshaken. Someone, was waiting for them. They reached the source of the light, a large chamber, its walls covered in the same shifting symbols they had seen before. In the center of the room was a massive cylindrical shape, almost organic in appearance, surrounded by a network of tendrils that writhed and twitched, like veins in a living being. It was not a station. Not a ship. It was something else. The soft voice came again, louder this time. "Help us. We've been waiting. Ilara's stomach churned as she stepped closer, drawn by the faint whisper of the voice. But as she neared, something shifted in the chamber. The temperature dropped sharply, the flickering light growing more erratic. A sudden pulse of energy surged through the room, throwing her and Arwen back. Ilara caught herself against the wall, her mind racing. "What was that?" she gasped, trying to steady her breath. "It came from the cylinder," Arwen said, his voice strained. "Whatever is in there, it's alive." Ilara's eyes narrowed. She was no longer sure what they were dealing with. The voice, the strange cylinder, it wasn't just a relic of an ancient civilization. It was a warning. And yet, she couldn't tear her eyes away from it. "We need to open it," Ilara said, her voice low. Arwen hesitated, fear flashing across his face. "Are you out of your mind? This, whatever it is, it's not something we can just open." But Ilara was already moving toward it, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the cylinder. She could feel the pulse of energy radiating from it, like a heartbeat. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Please, help us, escape," they begged. Ignoring Arwayen's protests, Ilara activated a panel on the side of the cylinder. The surface shifted, the smooth metal contorting and opening as if it were made of flesh, revealing the dark interior. The sight that greeted them was something out of a nightmare. Chapter 6: The Awakened Horror. Inside the cylinder, there was no body, no physical form. Instead, there was a vast, pulsing cloud of energy shifting, writhing in the air, its tendrils extending outward like a massive neural network. But it wasn't just a cloud of energy. It was something more, something ancient, trapped and starving, pulsing with a hunger that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of space itself. As Ilara stared into the core, the whispers intensified, becoming unintelligible, filled with desperation. She felt the urge to reach out to it, to connect with whatever was inside. She wasn't sure why. It was like an instinct, a primal pull that she couldn't fight. "Ilara, no!" Arwayen shouted, grabbing her arm. But it was too late. The moment her fingers made contact with the edge of the cylinder, the energy surged violently, coursing through her body like electricity. She screamed, her body convulsing as the world around her twisted and warped. Visions flooded her mind, images of twisted faces, distant screams, the silent void of space stretching endlessly. Her senses overloaded with the crushing weight of the entity's memories, its pain, its endless torment. It was as if it had been trapped here for centuries, eons, even reaching out to any living thing that came too close. And now, it was free. With a final, deafening roar, the energy exploded outward, throwing Ilara and Arwayen against the far wall. The cylinder collapsed in on itself, disintegrating into particles of light that vanished into the air. The station groaned, its walls buckling as though something immense had shifted inside. Ilara lay on the floor, gasping for breath, her body aching from the shock. She could hear Arwayen beside her, his voice a distant murmur, but her thoughts were consumed with the creature, whatever it was, that had just been unleashed. "We need to leave now," Arwayen said, pulling Ilara to her feet. But it was already too late. Chapter 7: The Unseen Pursuer. As they stumbled toward the exit, the station began to shake violently. The walls cracked, and the air was filled with the sound of groaning metal and collapsing structures. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. It was as if the station itself was alive, responding to the entity's release. Ilara's mind raced. The creature, they had awakened something far worse than they had ever imagined. Whatever it wasn't just a relic. It was a force, a being that had been imprisoned in this nebula for a reason. "Owen, we have to go," Ilara screamed, her voice hoarse as she pushed through the chaos. But as they neared the airlock, the doors slammed shut with a metallic screech. They were trapped. Ilara's pulse raced. No. Before she could react, the room darkened, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the corridor. The ground beneath them trembled, and the walls began to close in. There was no escape. From the shadows, something emerged. It wasn't a creature, at least not in any sense Ilara could comprehend. It was more of a presence, a force that seemed to be made of the very nebula itself, shifting, twisting, its form ever-changing. It moved with unnatural speed, its body rippling as if it was both part of the station and outside of it, a creature that defied space and time. The entity was here, and it wasn't alone. "Run!" Ilara shouted. She and Arwayen bolted toward the hatch, but the station seemed to fight them every step of the way. The walls closed in around them, and the once ominous, oppressive air now seemed alive with the entity's malevolent energy. Its whispers filled their minds, clawing at their sanity. "Help us!" the voice croaked. "Escape, before it takes you." Chapter 8: The Final Choice. Ilara and Arwayen reached the airlock just as the station began to collapse. The walls were crumbling, the floor buckling beneath their feet. The ground shook violently as they hit the emergency release, the door sliding open with a sharp hiss. Without looking back, they rushed into the ship, slamming the hatch behind them. The Starlight Voyager roared to life as Ilara slammed the throttle forward, blasting them away from the decaying station. But as they ascended, she could see it, a shape in the nebula, a shadow moving through the mist, chasing them. The entity had followed them. "Ilara, what do we do?" Owen shouted, panic rising in his voice. Ilara gritted her teeth, staring out at the endless void. The nebula's whispers echoed in her mind, louder than ever before. She realized, too late, that the true horror wasn't what they had awakened, it was what had been waiting for them all along. As the ship shot into the depths of the nebula, Ilara could only pray that they could outrun it. But deep down, she knew they couldn't. There was no escape. The lost nebula had claimed them. Chapter 9: The Breath of the Void. The Starlight Voyager cut through the dark mist of the nebula, its engines roaring to life as they fled. Ilara gripped the controls, sweat dripping from her brow. The ship vibrated with the raw power of the engines, pushing them faster and faster into the unknown. Behind them, the nebula roiled, its thick, oppressive presence closing in. The whispers still echoed in Ilara's mind, voices pleading, demanding, warning. They were no longer coming from the station. They were coming from inside the nebula itself, as though the very fabric of space had been infected by the entity's malice. Owen sat beside her, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Captain, we can't outrun it. It's faster than us. We won't make it." Ilara didn't answer, her focus fixed on the path ahead. The ship was pushing its limits, but they were already at the edge of their range. Every system was flashing red warning lights, power surges, and alerts. "Keep your eyes on the instruments, RYN. We're not stopping until we break through," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't believe her own words, but she couldn't afford to lose hope. "Not yet." Suddenly, the ship jolted violently, throwing them both from their seats. The ship's controls became erratic, flashing with static as the ship was pulled into an unnatural spin. Ilara's heart stopped. "What's happening?" she shouted, struggling to regain control. The nebula had caught them. Chapter 10: The Pull of the Abyss. Arwen scrambled at the console beside her. "We're caught in its gravity." His voice cracked with panic. It's pulling us back." Ilara's hands flew over the controls, but no matter what she did, the ship was drawn in. The view outside the viewport warped. Stars stretching, bending, distorting like they were being twisted in a mad dance. It felt like time itself was folding in on them. She could hear it now, the entity. Its voice didn't just echo in her mind, it filled the air. The sound reverberated through the ship, as though it were speaking directly through every system, through every piece of machinery. "We are one." The voice was cold, ancient, and distant, but it vibrated with an unmistakable power. "We were once many, but now we are lost." Arwen looked at Ilara, his face contorted with terror. "It's here. It's in the ship." Ilara couldn't answer. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she felt something cold, like fingers, brushing the back of her neck. She was no longer sure where the nebula ended and the ship began. The lines were blurring. The ship, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. "We have to stop it," Arwen cried. "We can't let it take over." Ilara's hands were trembling. "I know," she whispered, more to herself than to Arwen. "But how?" Chapter 11: The Choice to Listen. With every passing moment, the ship's systems faltered, its walls trembling as the presence grew stronger. The whispers turned into screams, terrible, disembodied cries that rattled the very bones of the ship. It wasn't just an entity. It was a collective consciousness, one that stretched across time and space, an ancient intelligence that had been trapped within the nebula, feeding on the souls of lost ships. Ilara's thoughts raced as she frantically tried to regain control. She was no longer simply fleeing, she was now being pursued by something that could tear her mind apart. Then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, she understood. The entity was not just chasing them, it was using them. They had become the latest in a long line of vessels caught in the nebula's grasp, their memories, their fears, becoming part of the entity's twisted essence. "We're becoming a part of it," Ryn shouted. His voice broke the silence of the ship, but it felt distant, like he was speaking through a fog. Ilara, we need to fight it. Ilara closed her eyes, trying to block out the voices, the terror. She needed to think. There was a way to stop it, a way to break free. If the entity was feeding off their fear, their panic, then perhaps she could use that against it. We need to disconnect from the network, Ilara said, her voice steady, almost too calm. The entity's using our systems to control us. If we cut off its access to the ship, maybe, just maybe, we can weaken it. Ryn's eyes widened in realization. The backup systems. The manual overrides. You think that'll work? It has to, Ilara said, pulling herself together. We don't have a choice. The ship groaned, the lights flickering wildly, as if the very heart of the Starlight Voyager was being torn apart. Ilara moved toward the access panel, her fingers flying over the controls. The walls shuddered, the air thick with the energy of the nebula. Chapter 12, Into the Maw. It's not enough, Ryn said, panic creeping into his voice. The station's collapsing. It's trying to drag us back in. Ilara took a deep breath. We need to get to the engines. If we can redirect power, we can burn through the nebula's pull. She turned to make her way toward the rear of the ship, but the lights flickered again, and the voices intensified. The air was thick with a presence that seemed to close in on her, suffocating. The ship was alive with a malevolent energy, every crack in the walls whispering in an ancient language she could almost understand. Ilara pushed forward, but it was no use. The walls twisted in front of her, the ship fighting back. Her fingers brushed against the wall, and the coldness of the entity's influence seeped into her skin, into her bones. The presence was growing too strong. Ilara. Ryn's voice was a distant cry, drowned out by the screams in her head. We need to leave. But Ilara didn't listen. She reached the engine room, her hand trembling as she activated the manual power controls. The engine hummed to life, its core lighting up with a violent energy. Ryn, she shouted. Get to the controls. We need to break free now. But before Ryn could respond, the ship lurched again. The walls buckled, and the station shook violently. The nebula was consuming them, twisting the very reality of their surroundings. The ship's systems faltered once again. They had no way to escape. Chapter 13, The Return to Darkness. The entity's whispers filled the ship now. They were everywhere. In the engines, in the walls, in the air. The very fabric of space felt stretched, as if the ship was being torn apart by the weight of it. Ilara could feel her sanity slipping. She could no longer tell where the nebula ended and her thoughts began. The entity's presence was too vast, too ancient. Ryn stood frozen, his hands shaking at the console. Ilara. It's too late. We're being absorbed into it. Ilara took a step forward, her heart pounding, her mind screaming to escape, to run, but she couldn't move. The ship had become a part of the nebula, and the nebula had become a part of her. There was no escape. The lights dimmed, and the whispers grew louder. Help us, escape, the voice moaned again, but this time, it was not a plea. It was a command. Ilara turned to Ryn, her eyes wide with realization. They weren't running anymore. They were the latest offering, the latest victims. And the nebula was not done with them yet. Chapter 14, The Shattered Mind, Step 6, Take. The ship trembled violently, as if the very walls were being torn apart. The atmosphere inside the Starlight Voyager felt thick with an oppressive presence, the air heavy with a chill that sunk deep into Ilara's bones. Every part of the ship hummed with the raw power of the nebula, pushing them deeper into its malevolent grip. Ilara's mind was barely her own anymore. The whispers were becoming louder, more insistent, the voice of the entity filling her thoughts, pushing against the fragile walls of her sanity. You cannot escape. Ilara staggered toward the control panel, her fingers trembling as she tried to stabilize the ship. The whispers clawed at her mind, urging her to give in, to surrender. Ilara, listen to me, Ryn's voice cut through the fog of her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. You're not alone. We still have a chance. We have to make a choice, now. Ilara turned toward him, her eyes hollow, her face drawn with exhaustion. The nebula was consuming her, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it win. "We have to get out of here," Ilara whispered, though her voice cracked with fear. "We can't let it take us. Not like this." Owen stood beside her, his face pale, but his body was stiff, his movement sluggish. It was like he was struggling to act, to reach out to her, but something was holding him back. "Owen," Ilara said, her voice growing frantic. "We need to act fast. We can still make it. Please, help me." But Ryn didn't respond. His lips were moving, but there was no sound. His mouth moved as if caught in an invisible force. His eyes were wide with panic, his hands shaking as they hovered above the controls, unable to move. Ilara's heart skipped a beat as she realized the entity had taken him. His body was here, but his mind, his will, was not. He was trapped, imprisoned by the same presence that was consuming her. The entity was feeding off his fear, his terror, just as it had done to so many before them. It had reached into Ryn's soul, paralyzing him, rendering him helpless. "Ryn!" Ilara screamed, but his expression was empty, hollow. His body wasn't responding. She could feel it now, the pull. The entity had rooted itself deep within him, just as it had inside her. It had become a part of them, its whispers curling around their minds, growing louder with each passing second. Ilara's chest tightened. She was running out of time. There was no way to save him, not without sacrificing everything. "Ilara," Ryn's voice broke through the haze. It was barely a whisper, barely recognizable. "You can't escape." It wasn't Ryn speaking. It was the entity, its voice wrapped in his body, distorted, cold. Chapter 15, The Heart of the Nebula, Step 7, Return. With a rush of adrenaline, Ilara's resolve hardened. She had no choice. Ryn was lost, he was already a part of the entity, unable to fight back. And now, it was pulling her in, too. "We have to escape," Ilara whispered to herself, a tear slipping down her face. She turned toward the ship's manual override controls, her hands shaking but determined. She activated the emergency thrusters, and the ship groaned as it was jolted forward. The engines roared, and for a moment, it felt like they might break free. The nebula's grip loosened just slightly, enough for Ilara to feel hope again. But the entity, furious at the attempt to escape, retaliated with a violent surge of power. The ship's systems blinked out. The lights flickered. And as Ilara desperately tried to regain control, she realized it was too late. The nebula had already set its claws deep into the ship. "Ilara, no," Ryn's voice echoed again, but this time, it wasn't his. It was the entity, mocking her. "You cannot outrun what is already inside." The walls of the ship began to crack, the metal warping under the pressure. The air inside the cockpit became thick, as though the very atmosphere was being sucked away, replaced by the cold emptiness of the nebula. "Please," Ilara whispered, her voice cracking. She could feel her body weakening as the presence pressed against her chest. It was like being submerged in ice water, paralyzed, suffocating. And that was when she knew. She had to make a choice. The entity was feeding on their fear, their desperation. It had already taken Ryn's will, and it was trying to take hers. The ship was no longer a sanctuary, it was a prison, and she would never leave it if she didn't do something drastic. "I'm sorry, Ryn," she whispered. "I love you." With shaking hands, Ilara disengaged the emergency release. The ship's thrusters kicked into high gear, but only for a few moments. She was already sealing herself in the escape pod, the only way to have a chance at survival. Chapter 16, Breaking Free, Step 8, Change. As the escape pod ejected from the ship with a violent lurch, Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. The Starlight Voyager was left behind, spiraling back into the heart of the nebula. Her eyes stayed locked on the wreckage, her chest tight, her throat dry with guilt. Ryn was still on that ship, still lost to the entity. The escape pod shuddered as it rocketed through the dark void. Ilara clutched the seat as the nebula's influence tried to follow her, its tendrils reaching out, clawing at her thoughts. But this time, she was free. The ship was gone. The entity would not follow her. But she knew it wasn't over. The Nebula's curse had already taken so much from her. Ryn. Her ship. Her peace of mind. She was alone, and even if she survived, she knew the price of escaping had been steep. As the stars began to form patterns in the void ahead of her, the escape pod stabilized. The ship's automatic systems kicked in, sending out a distress signal as she drifted toward the nearest colony. The pod's small window revealed the vast emptiness, the same dark void she had once embraced as a dreamer, but now it felt suffocating. "I'm sorry," Ilara whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't save you. I couldn't." Chapter 17, The Heavy Cost, Conclusion. Ilara looked at the fading remnants of the nebula in her rearview mirror, her hands shaking with exhaustion. The entity was gone, but it would never fully leave her. The whispers were still in her mind, fading, but always there. She had escaped. But the price was more than she could bear. Owen's face flashed in her memory, his desperate eyes, his outstretched hand reaching for her, and then, nothing. She had saved herself, but lost the one person who had stood by her through it all. The nebula might be behind her, but its presence would haunt her forever. As the escape pod drifted into the unknown, Ilara realized that survival had a heavy cost. And some losses could never be healed. The end.